this evening to hear from a range of speakers. They will fill us on some of the specifics, provide us with hope and motivation to go out yet again to our Premier, Mr Barnett, our Education Minister, Mr Collier, our Treasurer, Mr Buswell, and demand that they give WA kids an enhanced educational opportunity by signing up to the National Education Reform Plan. Without further ado, I introduce Angelo Gavrielatos, the AU President. He has a long and strong history with public education as a teacher and an education unionist. His passion for and pride in public education has been on exhibition throughout this campaign. Angelo, welcome.
It was in April 2010 that the then Minister for Education, Deputy Prime Minister and current Prime Minister Julia Gillard commissioned what has now become the Gonski Review. David Gonski, businessman, Chair of the Australian Stock Exchange, Chair of Coca-Cola Amatil, Chancellor of the University of New South Wales, etc., 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 was chosen to chair that review panel. And on that review panel were invited a number of other prominent and eminent persons, including Dr. Ken Boston, a former senior official in the Department of Education of Victoria, South Australia and New South Wales, Carmen Lawrence, who doesn't need any introduction in this audience, and they were supposedly there representing the public school side of things. It was never stated thus, but they try to get a balance on the panel. On the other side, looking after the interests of supposedly private schools, the Catholics and the independents, were Peter Tannock from the Catholic Education Commission and Catherine Greiner, who's the partner of Nick Greiner, former Premier of New South Wales and also on the board of a private university and a number of private schools. They then later brought on Bill Scales from the former Productivity Commissioner to give them some more advice, but there are others who can comment more on Bill's background. So that was the panel. That panel, as I said, April 2010. 7,000 submissions, 6,200 of which we proudly say that we contributed, we generated through our campaigning, because we set ourselves an objective, and that was one submission from every single public school right across this country. There are 7,000 odd public schools. Clearly there was more than one from each school, some schools, but nonetheless that was our target. By the end of the first year, we knew that we were on a good track with the review panel, because the review panel released an initial report bringing together a synthesis of all the submissions that have been put to them, but also what they've been able to garner through meetings and testimony that have been delivered by stakeholders. And in that report, they indicated that they had embraced the OECD's definition of equity. And the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, its definition of equity is hardly radical. It's hardly a radical organisation. It's funded by the wealthiest countries in the world. Their definition of equity is that every child should be able to achieve his or her full potential, regardless of their relationship or their parents to wealth, power, property or possessions. Every child achieves their full outcome. The moment the panel had embraced that definition of equity, we knew that the outcome would have to be positive for us. You can't say that every child's got to achieve their very best without regard for wealth, power, property, possessions, and not deliver a good report. Fast forward, they commissioned a number of pieces of research by internationally acclaimed academics and the like, and they were released in August, September of 2011. The picture that they were about to tell was already starting to take form, because all of that research demonstrated that the current funding system is broken and failing too many of our kids. The current funding system is contributing to a deepening inequality not only in the provision of education, but more disturbingly still in educational attainment, a widening of achievement gaps between our kids. By the end of that year, the report was completed in November or December of 2011, when it was handed over to the government, and the government released it in February 2012. And the report confirmed what we've been saying, validated, vindicated, not that we were seeking vindication, but validated what many of us have been saying, Trevor and others, we've been saying around the country for a long time. The current funding arrangements are failing our kids and the nation as a whole. That's what the report said. And the report went on to say and warn Australia's policymakers and I quote here, that there will be serious social and economic consequences if, as a nation, we don't act and act now. Because they recommended a new funding system based around a set of principles which would see that all schools would attract a notional amount of funding based on their total number of students they have, and then on top of that notional funding per student, there would be additional loadings to deal with equity, to address disadvantage. Quite simply, if you've got a lot of kids from poorer backgrounds, you'll get a lot more loadings. If you've got the kids who lack English proficiency, you get loadings. Students with disabilities, you get loadings. You enrol a lot of Indigenous kids, you get loadings. If you're a small school in an isolated setting, you get more loadings still. It was therefore clear that the major beneficiaries in such a system of funding would be public schools, government schools, open to all in every community. And hence, the Gonski review identified the need for an additional $5 billion invested in our schools in 2009 money, and that 75% of it, I'm moving forward here, 75% of it would go to public schools. The government then, I think regrettably, acted very slowly on the report. I've said it and I'll say it again, this should have been all done and dusted by the end of last year. By the end of last year, free from the heightened, not anxiety, but the heightened political tensions that always surround election years. It's a very complex piece of policy. It's one of the most significant reforms that any government could undertake. And indeed, it's probably the most significant moment in the history of schools funding, at least in the last many, many years. To allow that to drag into a period of heightened tensions associated with elections, I think is a major, major problem, and hence why we find ourselves in the difficulties in which we find ourselves. Negotiations started, I want to clear some myths here as well. I don't know how long I've been given, so I'll just keep on going until you tell me otherwise.
Timing now.
There's this myth going around. There's this myth going around, particularly by some premiers, that they don't have all the details. They don't have the details. I can say to you that is nonsense. That is absolute nonsense. There's been many, many meetings with senior officials from all jurisdictions since September of last year. Many meetings. I think there was a press release issued only yesterday by the federal government listing the number of meetings with senior officials. 50, 56 or something like that with senior officials. In September of last year, all jurisdictions got what they described as the calculator to allow state systems and private school systems, non-government school systems, to start calculating the impact of the formula on their schools. That was in September of last year. By the end of last year, they all pretty much knew what the ballpark figures were with respect to the additional investment required with a new funding system consistent with the Gonski principles. They all knew. Yes, there were changes being made, but changes being made at the insistence of government officials, state and federal, in negotiations. And each time you do a bit of tweaking, and there has been tweaking, in fact there's also been concessions to the non-government school system that I'm not particularly keen on or happy about, but each time there's some tweaking, the formula changes. But the point is, they've all been involved in negotiations since September of last year, and they've known pretty much what the lie of the land is since that time. Also, so that went through since last year. Fast forward to April of this year, the 12th of April, or 13th of April it was, Sunday the 13th of April, the Prime Minister finally made public, officials knew all this, made public what their offer was, with one difference. In making public what the offer was to all states and territories, the PM announced that the Commonwealth was prepared to pick up 65% of the bill. Up until that point in time, there was nothing in the public domain that suggested how the additionality would be split. Would it be 30-70? Would the Commonwealth pick up only 30% of the bill and the state 70% of the bill? As was recommended, or as was there was a reference to that in the Gonski review, or was it going to be 50-50? Well, what we learnt on the 13th of April, it was going to be 65-35. The Commonwealth would provide $2 for each $1 required by the states. Now, I've got to refer to another state here, and that's Queensland, because they're similarly, if I may say so, playing silly politics at a time and over an issue about which there should not be politics. There should not be politics. I was on a panel with the Minister for Education in Queensland, John Paul Lambrook, on the 6th of September last year. And he was carrying on a panel, it was Sky PM Agenda, chaired by David Spears. I don't know if you know David, he's one of the analysts on Sky Channel. And as we're having a discussion on the panel, John Paul Lambrook says, well, I don't know if we can pay 30-70 as come up with 70% of the money, but I'd be prepared to go 50-50. Ad break. I said, Paul, what are you talking? John Paul, what are you talking about? I said, does Campbell know this? Campbell Newman, does he know that you're going to go 50-50? Left it at that. Now, this is a guy who says, I don't know any detail. They keep on saying now, I don't know any detail. They've sent letters to their schools 3 times alleging hundreds of schools that will lose money under this formula, under this funding system, despite the fact that there's a guarantee that no school will lose any money. But they keep on sending out lists saying 200 schools plus will lose funding. Well, hang on, JPL. You either know some details or you don't know details. You can't have it both ways. You're saying you're prepared to go 50-50, but here's the classic, the clanger from JPL. After the April 13th, when Julia Gillard announced that they were prepared to pay $2 for each one required by the states, Queensland comes out and says, look, we've only just found out all the details. I said, yes, but the only thing that's changed is that they're prepared to pay $2 for each one required of yourselves, and you were prepared to pay 50-50. I think it's just made it easier for you. Now, if that doesn't illustrate that some people are playing games in this, I don't know what does. The fact is, the announcement made by the Prime Minister in April is for a further $14.5 billion over 6 years, of which government schools will get 83% of the money. $12.1 billion out of $14.5 billion over 6 years will go to public schools. 1.4 will go to Catholic schools, 1 will go to the independent school sector. Queensland will get stands to benefit to the tune of, or Queensland's children, to the tune of $3.8 billion. In New South Wales it's $5 billion, Victoria it's $4 billion, WA is $300 million, and I know that's been an issue of debate here. And I'll come back to address that head on. It's additional money for our schools, it's additional money for our kids. Better resources equal better results for every child. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. And just on the $14.5 billion and how it's carved up over the 6-year period, the truth is that the increases in the first few years are modest, to say the least. Modest. The money comes back-ended. Back-ended. Would we have preferred the money to come to be larger up front and spread out evenly? Too right we would. Too right we would. But my response is this. The modest increases have to be seen against the context of what the cost of inaction would be and what the losses would be in funding to public schools if we retain the current funding system. Next year alone, if there is no change to the funding arrangements, and obviously there will be after yesterday, but if there were, for some states, if there were to be no change to the funding system, next year alone, public schools would be $390 million worse off. Next year alone. That's the nature of the funding system, the Commonwealth funding system. That's the loss of almost 4,000 teaching positions. That's the loss of countless literacy and numeracy programs, extension programs, more individual attention to kids, and so on and so forth. That's how much we'd lose. So when there is a modest increase in the first few years, I say let's look at the modest increases in the context of what we would lose if there was no change. But we also need to look at it from another perspective as well. One of the conditions of the Commonwealth for states signing up is that they must grow their budget. They must guarantee growth of 3% a year for their budgets for education. Now that's very important for us because over the course of the last many years, state governments have been ripping us off with ever declining education budgets. This state as well. This state as well. Even announced recently with further cuts to education. Well, under this agreement, states can't cut into education anymore. They've got to commit to 3% growth of their education budget every single year. So that modest increase now starts to take on a different flavour when you look at the turnaround. In New South Wales, for example, there was supposed to be cuts of $1.7 billion over 4 years. Well, all the prospective cuts can't be made now. They stop, and they've got to start growing it at 3% a year, their budget, on top of the Commonwealth contribution. So yes, it's small, but it's got to be seen in the context of turnaround money. Secondly, the fact that it's back-ended. Clearly we would have wanted front-ended or at least evenly spread out. It's not. But again, what I say here, and I'm sounding conciliatory here, or almost as I'm an apologist, but our analysis shows us that even though it's back-ended, we can't overstate the significance of the structural reform that we've achieved. The maintenance of the current funding arrangements, the Howard government's funding arrangements, would see us continue to go backwards at a rapid rate. A rapid rate. We would continue to see a massive divide, a massive resource divide between our schools. That won't happen anymore. And over time, our schools will grow to reach a particular resource standard. Now that's a good thing. Clearly we would have wanted earlier. It will take 6 years for its full implementation. It will take 6 years to get to the point of that implementation of the Gonski model. The $5 billion that he talked about, which will be a lot more than $5 billion when it's fully implemented. Not only because of growth in funding through indexation, but through other tweaking and the like that's taken place. So this is significant reform for us. And just in terms of WA and the 300. So I've done a lot of radio interviews since the announcement in April, as has Anne and others. The way they calculated the figure for each state was based on how close their schools are to the resource standard. So it's clear that the level of funding in WA was higher than in other states. So WA may say, well, we're being ripped off. We can have that political discussion, but I'll put this to you. Ripped off in comparison to what? In comparison to how much other states are getting? Well, that's what we're signing up to. We're not signing up to a comparison about how much everyone gets. We're signing up to ensure that schools operate at a particular resource standard. And what I say is, it doesn't matter whether there are kids in Perth, Port Lincoln, Pooncarie, or Port Kembla. They've got to have the right to a resource level guaranteed where all levels of government chip in. Because you know what? In our classrooms each day, kids and teachers don't sit there and ask themselves whether this pen was courtesy of Colin Barnett, or whether that piece of paper was courtesy of Julia Gillard, or whether that book was courtesy of the Lamington Drive, thanks to our parents and our community, our parents' fundraising capacities. They don't do that in our classroom. They just care about what the total resource available to our schools is, and that's what's important. If you want to continue the debate about 300 million, and you want to go down the path of saying, well, why isn't it per capita funding? Well, confession time, we didn't campaign to get per capita funding. Because if we did, public schools would not have ended up with 83% of the money nationwide. We would have ended up with 67% of the money nationwide. We campaigned to ensure that our schools are resourced to a level that gives every child that great opportunity to succeed. That's what we campaigned for. It's not about per capita funding. Yesterday something quite significant happened, and I'll end on this point, Dan, because I think I've gone on for too long. The bill, the Australian Education Bill, amended, passed through the House of Representatives. The new funding system, subject to passage through the Senate, which will happen probably Monday week when Parliament resumes, or thereabouts, we now see a new funding system in Australia. Those states that sign up will start on that trajectory of ever-increasing funding. for our schools. Those states that don't sign up will continue to be funded under the existing arrangements, and public schools will continue to decline courtesy of that funding system. The choice is pretty clear. We either sign up to a funding system that puts kids front and centre and gives schools the resources to allow each child to achieve, and targets the resourcing to reflect disadvantage and to reflect, to allow schools to address disadvantage, or we continue on that downward slide in our funding system. Some states have said this is an attempt by the Commonwealth to take over schools and take over education. I hear that in WA, I hear that in Queensland, I hear that in Victoria. I'll tell you one thing. If it was a takeover by the Commonwealth of schools and school systems, why would New South Wales sign up? New South Wales still operates as if the rum is still the rum call. And everything happens in Macquarie Street, New South Wales. They didn't sign over anything. These are just diversions. No one's taking over anything. And everyone's got to be mature enough. Let's just grow up a bit and stop running these sort of nonsense lines that Canberra's come to take over our schools. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Barry O'Farrell in New South Wales did something that is very rare in Australian politics. He showed leadership. They had a caucus the night before, just before COAG on the 19th of April, and all the coalition, Liberal National Coalition states. And they agreed that no one was going to sign up at COAG. It's not uncommon. These things happen. But Barry O'Farrell wanted to sign up. And 3 days later, he blindsided all of them and said, I can't knock back an additional $5 billion for kids in my state. And he said, this is important. This reform is important in the interest of kids in this state. Well, it's equally important in Queensland. It's equally important in Victoria. It's equally important in WA. He rose above politics and put kids first. He stood up for the kids in New South Wales and stood up against Tony Abbott. And it's as simple as that, folks. There are a lot of issues. Clearly there's a lot of aspects of the reform that we would prefer to be slightly different or significantly different in some parts. But in comparison to what we would have in the form of the continuation of the current funding system, this is a darn sight better. A darn sight better. And for the first time in my history, and I dare say everyone's history in this, over the next 6 years there'll be guaranteed growth in funding in education. We've never been in that space ever, and that's a good thing. Thanks.